The village that held its breath. It is not the quiet of absence, not the ordinary hush of a lane without traffic, or a garden without wind. It is something closer to a held breath, the world muffled and pressed down beneath its white weight, every sound arriving late, arriving softened, as if even noise had lost the will to travel far in the cold. That was the quiet of Chidwick Hollow on the morning of the 23rd of December, and Jane Marple, standing at the window of her friend's small parlour, with a cup of tea growing cool in both hands, felt the weight of it pressed gently against the glass. She had arrived 2 days before, stepping off the afternoon train at Wickhurst Station, with one sensible bag and an expression her niece Raymond's wife always described as, "That look Aunt Jane gets when she's sizing something up." Miss Marple herself would not have put it that way. She would have said only that she was paying attention. She had always found that paying attention cost nothing, and occasionally saved rather a lot. Doris Plum, who had been Doris Haverfield before she married the postmaster, and who had known Jane Marple since they were both girls at a summer school in Bath, which neither of them ever spoke of in any detail, had met her at the door with an embrace and a worried look she was clearly trying to conceal behind the embrace. Miss Marple, whose eyesight was considerably sharper than people assumed, noticed it immediately. She said nothing. The village of Chidwick Hollow sat at the bottom of a shallow valley, flanked on 3 sides by birch wood, and on the 4th by a long, rising meadow that belonged to what had once been called the Hatch Estate, though it had not been an estate in any meaningful sense for 40 years. The house at the centre of it, Ivy Lodge, a long grey stone building with 12 windows and a porch that always needed painting, belonged now to Cornelius Hatch, who had been born in the village, left it at 19, accumulated money in ways that were never entirely clear, and returned at 57 with no wife, no children, a considerable collection of antique European ceramics, and the manner of a man who has spent decades being the most important person in whatever room he entered, and has begun to assume that this is simply the natural state of rooms. Miss Marple had not yet met Mr. Hatch, but she had heard rather a great deal about him in less than 48 hours, because Doris Plum, bless her, could not help talking, and because Chidwick Hollow, like every small village that Miss Marple had ever had occasion to know, was a community whose primary occupation was the management, distribution, and cautious exaggeration of information about itself. She knew, for instance, that Cornelius Hatch had a nephew, Gideon, the son of his estranged brother, who had arrived at Ivy Lodge without warning 3 days ago, and had not yet left. She knew that Mrs. Vera Almscroft, who had kept house at Ivy Lodge for 20 years, had been heard arguing with someone in the kitchen on Tuesday morning, and that the someone had not been Mr. Hatch. She knew that the village physician, Dr. Phineas Rook, had been seen walking very quickly away from Ivy Lodge on the afternoon of the 21st, without his usual hat, which was remarkable because December in the valley was not a month that forgave the bare-headed, and she knew. This she had learned simply by watching the Reverend Aldous Greer conduct the Wednesday evening prayer service, that the Reverend was carrying a weight that had nothing to do with theology. All of this she filed away with the practiced, unhurried precision of a woman who has sorted things all her life. Post office forms, parish registers, the anxieties of neighbours who arrived at her garden gate with questions they could not quite bring themselves to ask. She was still at the window when Doris came in with fresh tea. "The snow hasn't let up," Doris said, unnecessarily. She sat down in the armchair across from the window and wrapped both hands around her own cup. "It's been like this since midnight." "Yes," said Miss Marple. A silence. Then Doris said, in the voice of someone who has been rehearsing a sentence and has decided they will say it now or never, "Jane, about Cornelius Hatch." "Yes?" said Miss Marple again, still looking at the snow. "I don't know what it is, exactly. Only that something is wrong over at that house. Has been for weeks. You can feel it when you pass the gate. It's the sort of wrong that hasn't happened yet. Do you know what I mean? The sort that's been building." Miss Marple turned from the window then. She looked at her old friend with the clear, calm attention that she gave to most things. Not the cold attention of a detective sizing up a suspect, but the warm, patient attention of a person who understands that people very rarely say the most important thing first, and that the wisest response to what they do say is simply to make it clear that there is time and space and no judgment. "I know exactly what you mean," said Miss Marple. And then, "Tell me about the young woman, the art restorer. Doris looked up sharply. How did you? I haven't mentioned her yet. No, but when Mrs. Baxter at the post office mentioned the Hatch household yesterday, she named everyone in it, the nephew, the housekeeper, the doctor's visits, and then stopped, and looked at you before she went on. And you looked at the counter. Whatever she was about to say before she stopped herself, it was something she knew you had feelings about. Since you've mentioned everyone else quite freely, I assumed it must be the person she didn't mention. Doris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, her name is Lena Croft. She came in October. Hatch hired her to catalogue his collection. All those ceramics and paintings, he'd never had them properly documented. She's quiet, extraordinarily quiet, in the way that makes you notice it. She walks through the village sometimes in the evenings, and she doesn't look like a woman who is working. She looks like a woman who is waiting. Miss Marple set down her tea. Waiting, she said softly, is its own kind of occupation. What does she look like? 30, perhaps a little more. Dark hair. She has the sort of face that you look at and think you've seen before, and then you realize you haven't, because if you'd seen it, you'd have remembered. There's something behind the eyes. Something careful, Miss Marple repeated. She picked up her knitting from the side table. She was making a pair of gloves, the color of winter sky, and began, very slowly, to work. Outside, the snow continued its patient, relentless erasure of the landscape. The trees disappeared into white, the lane disappeared. The gate of Ivy Lodge, just visible from this window on a clear day, was completely gone. It was still snowing at 6 o'clock in the morning, when Doris's telephone rang. Miss Marple was already awake. She heard it from her room. One sharp ring, then Doris's footsteps on the landing, then a long silence, and then the sound of a person sitting down heavily on a stair. She wrapped herself in her dressing gown and opened the door. Doris was sitting on the top step, the receiver still in her hand, her face very white. It's Cornelius Hatch, she said. He's dead. They found him this morning, in his study. The door was locked from the inside. The windows, she stopped. The snow outside his window, Jane. They say there isn't a single footprint in it. Not one. It's completely undisturbed. Miss Marple stood very still in the doorway for a moment. Then she went back into her room and dressed and put on her stoutest shoes. She had the feeling, that particular, settled, quiet feeling she had learned not to ignore, that she would need them. What the snow could not cover. The constable's name was Briggs, and he had been the law in Chidwick Hollow for 11 years, which was long enough to have managed 2 stolen bicycles, one incident involving a heated boundary dispute, and a misplaced garden fork, and a great deal of paperwork about other people's misparked vehicles. He was a conscientious man and an honest one. He was also, Miss Marple noted, a man who was trying very hard to appear less alarmed than he was. He had come to Doris Plum's cottage because Doris, as postmistress, was on his list of people to notify in situations of community significance. He had not expected to find, seated at Doris's kitchen table with a cup of tea and a pair of half-finished gloves, a small white-haired woman who listened to his account of the morning with the focused, courteous attention of a person who is filing everything. You say the window was latched from inside, said Miss Marple, when he had finished. Latched, yes, ma'am. And the snow outside. The window of the study faces north, towards the beech hedge. The snow there is completely smooth, no marks at all, and the door was bolted, proper bolt, not just a lock, from the inside. We had to take the hinges off in the end. Who found him? Mrs. Armscroft, the housekeeper. She said she knocked at 7:30, as she always does, to bring his morning tea. When he didn't answer, she waited, and knocked again, and then she went to fetch the nephew, Mr. Gideon Hatch, and he and the gardener took the door apart. And the time of death. Dr. Rook estimates sometime between 10 o'clock and midnight. He'd been sitting in his armchair by the fire. The fire had burned down, but the room was still warm when they found him. His face was... Briggs paused, chose a word carefully. Peaceful. Rook says it looks like cardiac arrest, heart failure. He said this last part in a tone that suggested he did not entirely believe it. Miss Marple set down her cup. And the figurine. Briggs looked at her with open surprise. How did you... Mrs. Plum mentioned it. She had spoken with the gardener's wife this morning. He sighed. Yes, on his chest. A small porcelain thing. A shepherdess, apparently, from his collection. It was placed there. Not fallen, not knocked over. Placed, deliberately, on his chest. with his hands folded over it. Which is not, I think, consistent with cardiac arrest. No, said Briggs, it is not. He left shortly after, and Miss Marple sat for a few minutes in the comfortable, useful silence of a kitchen that smelled of toast and old wood. She turned her knitting over in her hands without working it. She was thinking about a man she had known in St. Mary Mead, old Mr. Fortescue, a pillar of the church, who had kept a figurine on his mantelpiece for 40 years, a shepherdess, blue and white, that had belonged to his first wife. When he died, in his chair, as people sometimes do, his housekeeper had placed the figurine in his hands before calling anyone, because she could not bear the thought of him lying there with nothing. She had been devoted to him. It had been her private farewell. The figurine on Cornelius Hatch's chest might mean something entirely different. It might mean precisely what it appeared to mean, a gesture of farewell, private and inexplicable, made by someone who had entered the room before the body was officially discovered. Or it might be something else entirely. It might be the kind of message that murderers sometimes cannot resist leaving. The kind that said, I know you. I know what you did. This is what you deserve. Miss Marple put on her coat and hat. She walked to Ivy Lodge through snow that came over the tops of her galoshes in places, which she accepted with the philosophical equanimity of a woman who has lived in England for 80-some years. The sky was iron grey, and still producing snow in the careless, indifferent manner of skies that have not yet decided to stop. The village was almost entirely empty. Smoke from chimneys, a dog barking somewhere behind the church, the distant sound of a child being called indoors. She did not knock at the front door of Ivy Lodge. She went instead around the side of the house, to the servants' entrance, and found Mrs. Vera Armscroft sitting in the kitchen with a pot of cold tea and the expression of a woman who has been crying and has decided, for the moment, to be done with it. Mrs. Armscroft was somewhere in her late 60s, stoutly built, with grey hair pulled back so severely it seemed to be holding her face up by force of will. She looked at Miss Marple when she appeared in the kitchen doorway and said, with weary directness, "Who are you?" "My name is Jane Marple. I'm staying with Doris Plum. I'm very sorry for what has happened. I wonder if I might sit with you for a moment." Mrs. Armscroft looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "Aye, sit then." They sat. Miss Marple said nothing for a while, which was a thing she was very good at. It was a skill that made most people profoundly uncomfortable, and the profoundly uncomfortable tended, eventually, to fill the silence themselves. Mrs. Armscroft lasted nearly 3 minutes. Then she said, "He wasn't an easy man. I'll say that before anyone else does, because if I don't say it, someone will say it worse." "No," said Miss Marple. "I expect he wasn't, but he was mine to look after. 20 years, longer than most marriages." She looked at the cold teapot. "I put the shepherdess in his hands. I expect you've heard that." I had wondered. I found him at 6:30, not 7:30, like I told Briggs. She said this without looking up. "I found him, and I sat with him for an hour, because I couldn't. I needed a moment before it all began, before it became a police matter, and a newspaper matter, and a family matter. I needed 1 hour where it was still mine. Does that make sense to you?" Miss Marple thought of old Mr. Fortescue and his housekeeper and the blue and white shepherdess. "It makes a great deal of sense," she said. "I put the figurine there because it was his favorite. He used to look at it when he was thinking. He'd pick it up and turn it in his fingers when something was weighing on him. It seemed right. Did something weigh on him recently?" A pause. Then, "He'd been different since October, since that girl came. Lena Croft. Yes, he hired her. He wanted her here. It was his idea, the catalogue. He'd been planning it for years. But after she arrived, after the first week, he changed. He started locking his study door at odd hours. He stopped eating properly. He jumped when a door closed too loudly." Mrs. Armscroft paused and pressed her lips together. "He was afraid of her. I don't know why. I don't know what she found, or what she said to him, or what passed between them. But he was afraid of her." Miss Marple absorbed this carefully. "And when did Mr. Gideon Hatch arrive?" 3 days ago, uninvited. Cornelius didn't want him here. I could see that. But he let him stay because turning away blood at Christmas is the sort of thing that gets talked about. Cornelius cared very much what got talked about. A small, complicated expression crossed Mrs. Armscroft's face. More than was good for him, in the end. Miss Marple thanked her, declined the offer of tea from the cold pot, and rose to leave. At the kitchen door she stopped and turned back. One more thing. The cat, Wellington, I believe his name is? Mrs. Armscroft looked startled. Yes. How did you? The food bowl in the corner. 2 portions, untouched. He's not eaten since yesterday, I'd guess. Where does he usually sleep? A long pause. The study, said Mrs. Armscroft slowly. He sleeps in the study every night, has done for 6 years. Cornelius never had to call him. He'd be at the study door by 9 o'clock every evening, regular as the clock. And last night, Mrs. Armscroft was very still. He wouldn't go near the door, she said softly. I noticed it, but I thought perhaps Cornelius had shooed him out earlier than usual, and I didn't think. She looked at Miss Marple. What does it mean? I'm not sure yet, said Miss Marple, but I'm going to find out. She walked back through the snow, and behind her, the single line of her footprints filled slowly and silently and was gone. The ones who carry things. There is a particular kind of person that Miss Marple had encountered many times over the course of a long life spent paying attention, and which she had never found a satisfactory name for, except perhaps the name that came to her now as she watched Gideon Hatch across the parlor of Ivy Lodge, the kind of person who carries charm, the way other people carry umbrellas. Ready for use, deployed at the first sign of weather. He was 34 or 35, tall, with the easy handsomeness of a man who has always found handsomeness useful. He wore a good jumper and an expression of appropriate grief, appropriate being the operative word, Miss Marple thought, because it was grief of exactly the right quantity, no more and no less, as if someone had measured it out for him. He had the same quality of emotional calibration she had occasionally noticed in very good card players. He stood when she entered, polite, which cost nothing, and said, Mrs. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I don't know your name. Miss Marple, I'm staying with Doris Plum. We are old friends. I came to offer my condolences, and also, I hope you'll forgive me, to understand, if I can, what has happened here. He looked at her for a moment with the appraising look of a man deciding what kind of threat, if any, a small white-haired woman in galoshes represents. Apparently she did not represent much of one, because he relaxed and indicated a chair. I didn't know my uncle well, he said, sitting across from her. The family had a history. My father and Cornelius fell out years ago, over something I was too young to understand at the time, and by the time I was old enough to want to, the rift had calcified. I came because it was Christmas, and because it felt wrong to let it go on any longer. I hoped, he paused, I hoped we might make something better of it. And had you? A flicker of something, too fast to read. We were working towards it. He wasn't an easy man to approach, but I thought we were getting there. What sort of man was he to approach, if I may ask? I never had the pleasure of knowing him myself. Gideon considered this with the air of a man choosing his words the way one chooses stepping stones across a stream, carefully, and only where the footing looked safe. Exacting, he said at last. He liked precision. He liked things catalogued and accounted for. You'll have noticed the state of his collection. He didn't care for sentiment, or at least he didn't show it if he had any. I think that's why the rift with my father lasted so long. Neither of them was willing to be the one who apologized first, and Cornelius especially. Once he'd drawn a line, he didn't redraw it. And yet he let you back in. He let me visit, Gideon corrected, with the faintest, weary smile. Whether I was let back in is a different question, and one I'm not sure I ever got an answer to. Did he seem well to you, in the days since your arrival? He seemed preoccupied, tired. I noticed he'd lost weight, more than was healthy. I assumed it was age. Did you notice the woman, Miss Croft, the art restorer? Something changed in his face then, quickly and then gone. Yes, quiet girl, very focused on her work. She and my uncle didn't seem to have much to do with each other. She was in the catalogue room most of the time, and he kept himself in his study. Did you speak with her yourself? Once or twice? She's not particularly forthcoming. No, said Miss Marple pleasantly. I don't imagine she is. She let a small silence sit between them, the sort of silence she had found, over many years, to be more productive than any question. Gideon did not fill it. She tried once more. Forgive an old woman's curiosity, Mr. Hatch, but were you aware your uncle kept a pipe? A tobacco, I understand, kept for 30 years. The change in him this time was smaller, but she caught it all the same. A stillness in the hands that had, until then, been resting loosely on the arm of the chair. "I knew he smoked," he said. "I didn't know the details. Should I have?" "Not necessarily," said Miss Marple, and rose, gathering her gloves. "It is only that the small habits of a man are so often the last thing anyone thinks to ask about, and so often the first thing that matters." She left him by the parlor fire and went in search of Dr. Rook, whom she found in the corridor near the study door, which was still open, its hinges rebuilt with a temporary bolt, apparently making notes in a small book and trying not to look as if he was lingering. "Dr. Rook," she said. He looked up and startled, which told her something. People startled by a small elderly woman are people who are already on edge. "Yes, I'm sorry, you are Jane Marple. I am a friend of the village postmistress. I understand you attended Mr. Hatch yesterday afternoon." He was somewhere in his 50s, thin and precise, with the kind of careful neutrality on his face that can be maintained for a long time before it starts to look like effort. It was starting to look like effort now. "A routine visit," he said. "You go without your hat when visiting routinely." A pause. "I was in a hurry to leave. I'd realized I'd left another patient's file at the surgery, and I needed to get back." He said this smoothly, the way sentences land when they have been prepared. "That is a very tidy explanation," said Miss Marple, in the mild, admiring tone of a woman complimenting a piece of needlework. "I always find that the explanations we have ready before anyone asks for them are the ones most worth a second look. Not because they are false, you understand, only because they have been so carefully made." Dr. Rook's pen had gone still over his notebook. "I don't know what you mean by that." "I mean nothing more than an old woman's habit of noticing when a coat has been put on inside out and then turned the right way round again in a hurry," she said. "You examined him some hours before he died, I think, not merely yesterday afternoon, and I think whatever you found troubled you enough that you have been standing in this corridor for some time, working out how much of it you are obliged to say." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "Forgive me. I'm only an old woman who notices things she has no business noticing. May I ask, is it possible the death was not natural?" He met her eyes then, directly, steadily, the way people look at you when they are deciding something. "Cardiac arrest," he said. "The post-mortem will confirm." "Will it?" The pause this time was longer. "There were signs," he said finally, so quietly she had to lean in to catch it, "that I would have expected to see in a man half his age, under other circumstances. I am not in a position to say more than that until the results come back. I would ask you not to repeat it. I keep a great many things to myself, Doctor. It is one of the few advantages of being overlooked." He looked at her for a moment as though he might say something further. Then he turned and walked away without another word, and Miss Marple watched him go with the expression of a woman who has been given an answer that contains no words. Lena Croft was in the catalogue room. This was a large, north-facing room on the ground floor that smelled of old paper and linseed oil, and the slightly dusty, complicated smell of old things being very carefully looked at. She was seated at a long work table with a lamp pulled close, and she did not look up when Miss Marple entered. "You're the woman from the postmistress's cottage," she said. She had a low, precise voice, and she went on working while she spoke, making small annotations in a large bound catalogue, her handwriting even and unhurried. "Yes," said Miss Marple. She looked around the room. Shelves of ceramics, paintings in stacks against the wall, carefully separated by cloth, a row of Dutch still lifes near the window, each one tagged and numbered. "This is lovely work. Cataloguing is undervalued, I always think. It requires a kind of patience and a particular kind of knowledge." "It requires knowing what you're looking at," said Lena Croft, without looking up. "Most people don't. They see a bowl of fruit and a dead pheasant and think that's the whole of it. They don't see the underpainting, or the repairs, or the places where a restorer 40 years ago did something clumsy and hoped no one would notice." "And do you always notice?" "I'm paid to." She set down her pen at last and looked up properly, and her face was exactly as Doris had described it. Not beautiful exactly, but the kind of face that stays in the mind, with something behind the eyes that was watchful without being hostile, careful without being cold. "Why are you here?" she said, not rudely, simply. Miss Marple sat down, uninvited, on the stool near the door. She looked at Lena Croft for a moment without speaking. Then she said, very gently, "I think you came here for a reason that had nothing to do with the catalogue." The silence that followed was not an uncomfortable one. It was the silence of a person deciding how much they are going to say, and to whom. "He had a pipe," said Lena Croft at last. "He smoked it only in his study, every evening. He'd been doing it for 30 years at least. You could smell the tobacco on the books he kept in there." She paused. "I noticed it when I first inventoried the study. The pipe and the rack of tobacco. The same brand, 30 years. Very particular about it." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Habits that old," said Lena Croft, "are very easy to use against someone." "They are," Miss Marple agreed. "A man who has done the same small thing at the same hour for 30 years no longer thinks about it at all. He does not taste it, in the way one stops tasting a food eaten every day. He would not notice if something in it were different." Lena Croft's hands, which had been still on the desk, moved very slightly, straightening a corner of the catalogue that did not need straightening. "I wouldn't know about that," she said. "I restore paintings. I don't know anything about tobacco." "No," said Miss Marple, "of course not." She let the silence stretch again, watching the lamplight on the other woman's face. "It is only strange to me, Miss Croft, that a restorer engaged for a fortnight's work should know the exact age of a man's tobacco habit, down to the year." "I notice things," said Lena Croft. "You said so yourself. It's undervalued." "It is," Miss Marple said, and smiled, though there was nothing unkind in it, only the patient, watchful smile of a woman who had heard a great many careful answers in her life, and had learned to be fondest of the ones that were slightly too careful. "Your father's name, was it Croft?" A pause of perhaps 3 seconds. "No," said Lena. "It was Alderman, but Croft was my mother's name. I took it back when I was old enough to choose." "And your mother," said Miss Marple, "did she know Mr. Hatch?" Lena Croft looked at her for a long moment, and something in her face, not quite grief, not quite anger, something older and more tired than either, moved across it and was gone. "You ask a great many questions for a guest of the postmistress," she said. "I ask a great many questions because I am old and no longer expected to mind my own business," said Miss Marple. "It is one of the very few privileges of my age, and I have found it best not to waste it." Lena Croft did not answer that. She picked up her pen and went back to her work, and Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment, watching the lamp burn steadily over the careful, unhurried hand, and thought that of all the people she had spoken to in that house so far, it was this one whose silence troubled her the most, not because it hid nothing, but because it had clearly been practiced for a very long time. When she left the room, Lena Croft was still writing, her face composed and utterly unreadable, and the smell of old paper and linseed oil followed Miss Marple out into the corridor, like something she could not quite put down. Old grievances, new snow. The Reverend Aldous Greer lived in the vicarage at the north end of the village, a tall, narrow house with a garden that in summer was extraordinary, roses climbing every available surface, lavender in long rows, and in winter was merely a diagram of a garden, all bare structures and promise. He was in his late 60s, white-haired and slightly stooped, with the kind of face that in its youth might have been called handsome, and in its age had become something better than handsome, the face of a person who has thought about things for a long time. He offered Miss Marple tea, which she declined politely, and then sat across from her in his study, and waited with the patience of a man accustomed to pauses that hold weight. "I understand you visited Mr. Hatch on the afternoon of the 22nd, said Miss Marple. "I did, and that you left in some distress." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the snow had finally begun to relent, thinning to occasional, careless flakes. The study smelled of books and that churchly smell, wood, cold stone, old cloth, that follows certain people into their homes, the way other professions follow others. Miss Marple had always associated it with deep thinking. "I have a responsibility," he said at last, "that I've been weighing since yesterday afternoon, a thing I know, that I perhaps should have acted on sooner, that I did not act on sooner because it was told to me, not in confession, precisely, but in confidence, and the difference between those two things, in a village like this one, is smaller than theology would suggest." "You needn't tell me what was said to you," said Miss Marple. "Perhaps only this, was what was said to you about something that happened 30 years ago." He looked at her with open surprise. "Yes, how? Because everything in this house is about something that happened 30 years ago. The whole affair has the quality of a very old wound that has never healed properly." Old wounds sometimes look like fresh injuries. They're not. He pressed his fingertips together. Cornelius Hatch came to me, he said carefully, 2 days before he died. He came not as a parishioner seeking pastoral care, but as a man who was frightened. He told me that someone in his house knew a story he had kept secret for 30 years, a story about a young painter, a man named Alderman, whom Cornelius had accused of forging one of the Dutch paintings in his private collection. He had been wrong. He had known at the time that he was wrong. He had made the accusation anyway, because the painting was worth a great deal, and because he wanted the insurance money, and because Alderman was young and unknown, and Cornelius Hatch was neither. The Reverend paused. Miss Marple waited. The accusation destroyed Alderman's career. He could not find work. He spent the rest of his life, some 24 years, in increasing poverty and obscurity. He died 8 years ago, and someone in that house knew all of this. Cornelius believed, was certain, that they intended to expose him, publicly, before he died if possible. Did he know who it was? He suspected the art restorer. He could not prove it. He said she had been asking questions about the provenance of that particular painting, the Dutch one, the one at the center of the old accusation. She was thorough, too thorough, he said, the kind of thorough that means you already know what you're looking for. And what did he want from you? He wanted me to tell him what to do, whether to confess it before she could expose him, or whether to— The Reverend stopped. He used a phrase about making her understand that silence was in her interest, not a phrase I could endorse. I told him that clearly. That is why I left distressed, because he received that counsel very badly, and because I walked away from the conversation afraid that Cornelius Hatch was capable of worse than false accusation. Miss Marple sat with this for a moment. Then, did he say what form the painting's false accusation had taken? Specifically, a letter. Apparently he had written a letter, formal, detailed, full of what appeared to be expert evidence, accusing Alderman of forgery. He had kept a copy. He told me the copy was still in his study, in the locked desk drawer. Miss Marple stood. Thank you, Reverend. You have been very helpful, and I think perhaps you should call Constable Briggs this afternoon. He nodded, the decision already made behind his eyes, the weight of it already lifting. The afternoon was failing, the sky turning from grey to something darker, when Miss Marple walked once more past Ivy Lodge and paused at the gate. She looked at the north-facing window of the study. The snow outside it was perfect and white and empty, not a mark on it. Constable Briggs had been right. It was completely undisturbed. From here, you could see the window clearly. A casement window, latched inside. Below it, approximately 3 feet of smooth snow between the wall and the beginning of the beech hedge. Miss Marple looked at this snow for a long time. Then she looked at the beech hedge. Then she looked at the window again, very carefully, and thought about what she could see from where she stood, and what she could not see, and what the difference between those two things might mean. She thought about a woman she had known in St. Mary Mead, a clever woman, a practical woman, who had once hidden something in a room by the simple expedient of putting it in the most visible possible location, where no one thought to look, because everyone assumed it had been examined already. She thought about the inside of the windowsill, and the snow upon it that Mrs. Armscroft had described as disturbed in a way inconsistent with natural settling. She thought about what could cause that particular kind of disturbance from the inside, without opening the window. She thought about the pipe. She thought about 30 years, and a man who had died in poverty, and a daughter who had come home, in a manner of speaking, to collect a debt. She thought about all of these things, and by the time she turned and walked back towards the village, the sky had closed entirely, and the snow had begun again, quiet and purposeful, and without remorse. The mechanism of it. That night, Miss Marple sat by Doris Plum's fire, and did not knit. This was unusual. Knitting was, for her, a form of thinking, the hands occupied so the mind could move freely, following a thought the way a thread follows a needle, in and out, the pattern building slowly, each stitch a piece of a whole that only became visible when you stepped back. But tonight she set the gloves aside, because the pattern had become visible, and she found she needed her hands free. She thought about the pipe. Cornelius Hatch had smoked the same pipe, the same tobacco, in the same room, every evening for 30 years. The pipe would be intimately familiar to him, the weight of it, the draw of it, the particular way a 30-year-old briar responds when it is well maintained and well used. It would also be intimately familiar to anyone who had spent 6 weeks in that house, watching, learning the landscape of his habits. She thought about what you could introduce into a pipe without a man noticing. Tobacco was already a complex substance. There were things, she did not know their names, but she knew they existed, because there had been a case in St. Mary Mead decades ago, involving a gardener and a husband whose whiskey had been treated in a similar manner. Things that could be introduced in very small quantities, things that built up over time, things that in a man of Hatch's age and constitution might culminate, over 6 weeks of daily use, in something that looked precisely like cardiac arrest. That would be why his face had been peaceful. That would be why Dr. Rook, who would have had no reason to test for such things without cause, had certified cardiac arrest before the post-mortem. That would also be why Wellington the cat had not gone near the study door. Cats were more sensitive to such things than people gave them credit for. She had read that somewhere. She believed it completely. The locked door was simpler. The bolt on the inside was a sliding bolt. She had noticed it when the study door stood open during the day. A sliding bolt of the old kind, not a mortise, but the horizontal sort that sits in a bracket. Such bolts could be managed from the outside, through the old keyhole, with the right implement and enough patience. She knew this because her brother-in-law had accidentally locked himself in his study once with exactly such a bolt. She could not have been more than 22, and she herself had opened it with a length of bent wire. It had taken her perhaps 4 minutes. The window was the cleverest part. The snow outside was undisturbed because no one had gone through the window. The window had never opened. But the snow on the inside of the windowsill was disturbed, and the reason for that disturbance, Miss Marple now believed, was a mechanism that had been removed. She thought about the fire. The fire had been burning when the body was found, though it had burned down considerably. This meant that either Cornelius Hatch had stoked it himself. Possible, but the timing was wrong, if he had died between 10 and midnight, or that it had been stoked by someone else, earlier, in a particular way. A prepared arrangement of coal, laid carefully in a specific pattern, with a quantity of slow-burning material underneath, and a timing element. Nothing sophisticated, nothing modern, simply the old chemistry of combustion, understood by a person who was patient and methodical, and had had 3 months to plan. Such an arrangement, lit before the household retired, would burn slowly, and then catch suddenly some hours later, giving the impression that the fire had been recently tended, adding to the illusion that Cornelius Hatch had been alive and active in the room well into the night. It was this, the fire arrangement, that had also caused the disturbance on the interior windowsill. The mechanism for introducing a quantity of powdered material through the old, drafty window frame, not opening the window itself but using the gap at its edge, the inevitable gap of Old English casement windows in Old English stone houses, would have needed to be removed before the household woke. It could be removed through the same gap. A thin wire, a small hook, a person standing in the snow. No, standing in the beech hedge. The beech hedge that ran along the property boundary 4 feet from the window, close enough for a person of moderate height to reach the window frame while standing within the hedge's solid interior, and which would have left no footprints in the snow between the hedge and the house. Miss Marple thought about a woman walking calmly back through the snow at midnight, entering by the kitchen door, which Mrs. Armscroft, she had noted, did not lock, because she rose at 6 and the kitchen door was the first thing she opened, and there was no point in bolting a door you'd be unbolting in 6 hours, and going to bed. And in the morning, behaving exactly as she had been behaving for 6 weeks, quietly, carefully, with her face composed, and her eyes watchful, and her hands making small annotations in a large bound catalogue. The tragedy of it, Miss Marple thought, was not the murder, not even the 30 years of injustice that had preceded it. The tragedy was that a young woman of extraordinary intelligence and patience had spent years, not months, years, building and executing a plan that had its own cold logic and its own cold justice, and that she had been right about the injustice, absolutely right, and it did not matter. Justice, Miss Marple had learned over a very long life, is not something that private individuals can administer without becoming something they did not intend to become. The grief is real, the wrong is real, but the solution, the private, patient, meticulous solution, requires a person to spend 3 months in a house, learning how to kill someone, And that is a cost that shows, afterwards, in ways that cannot be undone. She thought about Lena Croft's face, something careful behind the eyes. Yes, it would be careful, wouldn't it? The careful face of a person who has been building something for years and has finally, quietly, finished building it. The careful face of a person waiting to see whether anyone will understand what they have done and why and what it cost. Miss Marple picked up the telephone. "Constable Briggs," she said when he answered. "I think you had better come to Doris's cottage tomorrow morning. I have some things to tell you." She put the receiver down and sat for a while in the warmth of the fire, and did not feel triumphant, and did not feel satisfied, and thought about a man named Alderman who had died in poverty and obscurity, and had never known that anyone would come. What remains? On the morning of the 24th of December, Constable Briggs came at 9 o'clock, as requested, and sat at Doris Plum's kitchen table with a notebook open and his pen poised, and an expression of concentrated attention that Miss Marple found, in its unassuming competence, rather touching. She told him everything, not in the manner of a detective making a pronouncement. She had never been particularly comfortable with that particular style, which she associated with a kind of showmanship that struck her as unnecessary, but in the manner of a person setting out a set of observations and asking another person to consider what they mean. She laid out the pipe, the fire, the hedge, the bolt, the snow on the interior windowsill. She laid out the story of the painter Alderman and the false accusation and 30 years of consequence. She laid out the name Lena Croft had not been born with, and the mother whose name she had reclaimed. Briggs wrote. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he sat for a moment, looking at what he had written, and then he said, "The pipe would be the key thing. If the post-mortem finds something in the tobacco residue, something that shouldn't be there." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "I believe it will." And she was in that house every day for 6 weeks, with access to his study when he wasn't in it. She catalogued the study herself in the first 3 weeks, before he became suspicious of her and started locking it. And the window mechanism, if she used the hedge. The snow inside the hedge may still hold impressions. It snowed again last night, but only lightly, and the beech hedge is dense enough to shelter what is underneath it. I would not wait. He stood. He was a careful man, and she could see him already marshalling the sequence of it. The post-mortem request, the hedge, the pipe residue, the statement from the Reverend. He was, she thought, going to be adequate to this. Perhaps more than adequate. At the door, he turned back. What about Mrs. Armscroft, concealing the time of discovery, finding him at 6:30 and reporting at 7:30? She sat with a man she had loved for 20 years, said Miss Marple. For an hour, in private, before the world came in. I don't think that requires anything from you, Constable. He considered this for a moment. Then he nodded and left, and the snow crunched under his boots all the way to the gate. Miss Marple did not go to Ivy Lodge that morning. She had thought about whether she should. She had thought about it for most of the night. There was a part of her, a part she did not disavow, because she had learned not to disavow the parts of herself that were inconvenient, that wanted to sit across from Lena Croft one more time and simply say, "I know," not as an accusation, simply as an acknowledgement. "I know what your father was worth, and I know what was done to him, and I know what it cost you to come here and do what you did, and I know it will cost you more before you are done." But she did not go, because there was nothing she could offer that would help, and the offering of useless things, however sincere, was a kind of self-indulgence she had always tried to resist. Instead, she walked to the church. The Church of St. Bridget's had stood at the centre of Chidwick Hollow for 600 years, and it wore its age well, solid, unassuming, with the particular quality of old stone buildings that have been prayed in for a very long time, and have absorbed something of all those prayers into their walls. The Reverend Greer was inside, arranging something at the altar for the Christmas Eve service, and he looked up when she came in. They sat together in one of the old pews, the light coming pale and winter-thin through the windows, the smell of old wood and the faint ghost of incense from some earlier service, and did not speak for a while. Then the Reverend said quietly, "She's going to be arrested." Yes, she will have known that was the likely outcome. "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that she decided the outcome was acceptable, not desirable, but acceptable. I think she decided that being the person who did this was worth more to her than anything that might happen to her afterwards. That is the most dangerous kind of decision a person can make. because it removes all the ordinary fears that keep most of us from doing terrible things. And yet the thing she was responding to was itself terrible. Yes, that is what makes it so. She paused, choosing the word with care. Sad. That is the word, I think. Sad. Not tragic in the Greek sense. Not the clash of equals. Not the fall of the great. Just sad. A family broken. A man ruined. A daughter shaped by that ruin into something she might otherwise never have been. And a man dead in an armchair in a locked room on the 23rd of December. And nobody really the better for it. The Reverend was quiet. Then, what will happen to Gideon Hatch? He will inherit, I imagine. He came here to inherit, though I don't think that was the whole of it. There is something in him that is not simply opportunism. There is grief in him, somewhere, for a relationship that never existed, and might have. The relationship with his uncle that he described might have been partly genuine, in intention if not in practice. And Dr. Rook? He will have to account for the haste of his certificate. Whether that accounting amounts to something serious, I don't know. He may have had reasons, good ones even, for not wanting to look more closely. He struck me as a man who had been asked not to look closely, and who had complied, and who was already living with the weight of that compliance. That is its own sentence, of sorts. She stood, and smoothed her coat, and looked around the church. The old stone, the thin winter light, the flowers someone had placed at the altar for Christmas. Ordinary flowers, white and green, sensible and real. Do you know, she said, what I keep coming back to? Tell me, said the Reverend, the snow. Everyone spoke about the snow as if it were evidence of something impossible. How could it be murder when the snow was undisturbed? No footprints, therefore no one had entered. No one had entered, therefore it must have been natural. The snow was the alibi. The snow was the whole of it. She paused. But snow only covers footprints. It doesn't cover the reason someone walked somewhere in the first place. It doesn't cover the intention, the history, the 30 years of accumulated weight that made someone put on their boots and pick up a length of wire on a winter night. The footprints were gone. The lie was still there, perfectly intact under the snow. Lies always are. They're heavier than footprints. They don't disappear with the thaw. The Reverend looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I hope you'll stay for the Christmas Eve service, Miss Marple. I think I will, she said. I always find Christmas Eve services rather comforting, the carols especially. There is something about singing together in a cold church that reminds one that most human beings, most of the time, are doing their best. She walked to the door and turned back. Even when their best is not enough, she said, it still counts for something. She went out into the December air, into the village that was quiet with snow, into the morning of Christmas Eve, and behind her, the church door swung gently closed. Lena Croft was arrested on Christmas morning. She went with Constable Briggs without resistance and without drama, wearing her coat and carrying a small bag that she had apparently packed the previous evening. She looked, Doris Plum told Miss Marple later, Doris had seen it from her window, like a person who has completed a task they have been working on for a very long time and is now simply ready for what comes next. The post-mortem found traces of a compound in the tobacco residue of Cornelius Hatch's pipe that had no business being there. The impressions in the snow beneath the beech hedge were consistent with a person of Lena Croft's height and weight, standing at the edge of the hedge for some period of time. The Reverend gave his statement. The discovery, in the locked desk drawer of the study, of the letter, the original letter, 30 years old, in Cornelius Hatch's own hand, accusing Geoffrey Alderman of forgery, was noted in the official record and contributed, in the trial that followed, to the context that the defense argued and the prosecution had to address. It did not change the verdict, but it changed the sentence, and Miss Marple, reading about it months later in a newspaper sent to St. Mary Mead by Doris Plum, with a note clipped to it that said, "Only thought you'd want to see this," set the paper down on her kitchen table and sat for a while with her hands folded and her eyes on the garden. It was spring. The garden was doing what English gardens do in spring, coming back tentatively, as if surprised to find itself still alive. The first daffodils, the particular pale green of new leaves, the blackbird that nested every year in the rose at the back fence, already building. She thought about a man named Geoffrey Alderman who had loved his work and been destroyed for it. She thought about a daughter who had loved her father enough to spend years of her life on his behalf, and what that devotion had cost her, and what it had made of her, and whether, she could not quite stop asking the question, even though she knew the answer, whether there had been another way. There had always been another way, there always is. The tragedy is not that people cannot see it. The tragedy is that grief, in sufficient quantity and sufficient duration, makes the other way feel insufficient, makes it feel like nothing, makes it feel like less than what the dead deserve. Miss Marple understood that. She did not endorse it. She understood it. She got up and put the kettle on and went to water the daffodils, and the blackbird, startled, flew out of the rose with a sound like something beginning. End.